Hallo und herzlich willkommen von der Developer Week 2018. Neben mir sitzt Jeff Fritz. Jeff Fritz, is Senior Program Manager with the Developer Division from Microsoft, and he leads the ASP.NET WebForms team. And in his keynote he just held, he proposed that we should have more open source software. Why?
It's a great question. And when we think about open source software, right, it's about sharing. It's about having access to be able to work with the technology in a way that we didn't used to have. We can see what's happening with our code, with our frameworks, with our tools, just below the surface. So if we have questions about how things are functioning, if we think, you know what, I've introduced an issue, I've created a bug, you know, in my code. If I get through and I can't find the source of that bug, I can actually peek underneath that tool that I was using and now learn a little bit more about how it functions and then figure out maybe it isn't my bug. Maybe it's a bug in the .NET framework. Maybe it's a bug in Visual Studio. Maybe it's a bug in my Java SDK. You know, it gives us a little bit of insight as to how those things function. But then on the other side of things, if I need to build an application for high performance, it also allows me to see how those tools are working so that I can take advantage of writing better performing software that uses the frameworks and tools the way they were designed, right?
Yes, I understand, but just Microsoft comes from the field where you have the cathedral and not the bazaar. Microsoft is a typical closed source company. Right now it's opening and open sourcing a lot of software, but even ASP.NET WebForms isn't open source, I think.
Right. So you make a couple of very good points there. Microsoft traditionally was very closed source. Yeah. You're absolutely right. Things like Windows are closed source. They're not sharing the source code for Windows, and you're probably not going to see that. But there are things that they are doing that are open source in nature with how they build Windows. They want to use continuous integration to build Windows. They want to use Git source control with Windows. So they build Windows on a regular basis, and they take advantage of some higher scale tools to do that. They're releasing those tools open source. They are making them available because they realize that if they're building something that's as big as Windows, there's other organizations out there that are going to have the same problems. And we've learned that we don't need to control all of those things all of the time. It's much more beneficial for things like the .NET framework, for things like ASP.NET MVC, to share that source code and get other folks involved earlier. And you're right, WebForms is closed source, but it's also what we call source opened, where...
What?
Yeah, I know. Right, when we think of open source typically, there's also the expectation that we accept contributions, right? Other people can make changes and submit a suggestion, a pull request that says, here's an idea that can improve things, right? With the source opened model, you can actually go to referencesource.microsoft.com and you can see the source code for things like WebForms, and it's the source code for that framework. Now, there's a problem when you go just below the surface for WebForms, that it starts integrating very tightly with the web server, the IIS web server used by Windows. And at that point, that server is closed source and they won't share that source code. So that back and forth that we see there, we can't make fully open source because of that integration. But you're welcome to go and see the source code. It's out there online. So there's a shortcut if you go to sourceof.net. You'll be able to see it, and you search for system.web when you get to that website, and you'll see the source code for it. But like I said, you can look, but don't touch.
Okay. So you propose that it is like in real life. You shouldn't always eat meat and never eat noodles.
Or vegetables, absolutely.
But from everything a little bit. So
Yes, everything in moderation. I think there's a place for a lot more open source inside of the Microsoft ecosystem, in the things that Microsoft builds and publishes. There's absolutely an opportunity to do more there. But there are some parts of the organization that it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And for security reasons, it makes sense to keep things closed. You know, there are parts of the Azure cloud system that are open source. Right? The tools, the command line tools, are available in open source for folks to be able to learn from and integrate with their tools. But some of the low-level hosting capabilities of Azure, they're not going to share that. So it's here and there.
Okay.
You're right.
Now, ASP.NET WebForms, with ASP.NET Core and Angular, some kind of front-end framework, the WebForms aren't so pushy and aren't so pushed anymore.
No.
Can we expect their kind of development even in this direction?
So what we're seeing with WebForms, because it has that very control-centric paradigm with how you use the framework. Things like Angular you can use with it, but Angular is much more compelling with how you work with JavaScript. All of the server-side operations that occur with WebForms, it's not as favorable right now. It's not something that folks prefer, right? The pendulum has swung to a very client-side development model with TypeScript and JavaScript, Angular, Vue, choose your JavaScript framework. And that's okay. That's great. The development that we're seeing on WebForms really is geared towards let's enable folks to be able to refactor their WebForms applications, so they can start taking advantage of the new innovations in .NET Core, in .NET Standard, so that you can grow as the ecosystem moves into .NET Core and cross-platform and away from being just Windows-centric.
Are there any movements to integrate in ASP.NET WebForms the Angular part kind of framework? Because as I remember right, there is this render at server. So sometimes there was an idea to render at front end and the client.
Yes.
So this would be a step I would expect.
It would be a step in a direction to allow tighter integration with client frameworks like Angular. What we're seeing though is that customers, that developers that are using ASP.NET WebForms would prefer not to do that type of refactoring. They would prefer to back out and just wholesale move over to another environment. They don't want to take that one step, you know, into using that user interface where they still can't control what Angular features are being used, right? They can't, they'll get the look and feel of Angular, but it's not something that they would be able to migrate to Angular as easily. So that's fine. There's ways around that. There's ways folks can still write whatever HTML, whatever JavaScript they would like into that WebForms front end without using the control model, and still take advantage of all the feature-rich tooling that's in Visual Studio for them.
Now you have an own channel where you develop your software. It's a kind of CMS, content management system, and it's a very special way your channel works. Can you explain it?
So I've started a channel on Twitch, so twitch.tv/C#Fritz, and I'm out there a few days a week, very much like a radio call-in show. That I'm not sure what you would call that here in Germany.
I want to hear your message in a bottle.
No, there's a little bit of that where you would call in to a disc jockey to request music to be played, but this would be people calling in asking questions. In the States we have NPR, National Public Radio. People call in and they ask questions about, you know, how to better manage money, things like that, but there's never really anything for a developer, for technologists. So I got this idea. I saw some friends, they were writing code online, but it was JavaScript. And I thought, well, we could do that with .NET. And so I turn on my webcam, I share my screen, and I work on, you mentioned this CMS that I call Core Wiki because it's written with ASP.NET Core. And it's like a wiki, like Wikipedia. And what we do is, it's an open source project. I start writing code online. It's on GitHub. Anybody can contribute. Anybody can ask questions about it. So as we're building and teaching folks, and it's really more about a teaching thing. It's not about actually being productive and delivering the product. You know, that's great too, that we actually have a product to deliver. But showing and sharing, you know, here's how you write a web application for folks who are in university, for folks who aren't familiar with C# or ASP.NET Core, and they can learn by asking somebody who's on the team, you know, those basic questions and get quick feedback from the chat room because it's a friendly face and it's a welcoming environment. It's a great thing that for people to participate in. So I think it's an opportunity for us to think differently about education.
Great. With this whole stuff, last question.
Sure.
That Microsoft has opened itself, has it to do with the new CEO, Satya Nadella, do you think?
That's a very good question. Satya Nadella is a tremendous influence on the organization. He changed our motto, our slogan to enable everybody to achieve more. Right, and when you think about enabling everybody to achieve more, right, that's not just us as developers or technologists working in the cloud, right, but it's also the students out there. It's also, right, the grandparents that are out there and want to talk to their grandkids and everybody. How do we help everybody achieve more? And open source is a great way for us to allow everybody to contribute and be able to grow these technologies. But in actuality, the first approval for open source at Microsoft came from his predecessor, Steve Ballmer. It wasn't broadcast very loudly, but those initial approvals for ASP.NET MVC, when that was the first bits that were open source with contributions from the .NET team, that was under Steve Ballmer. That was led by Scott Guthrie, right, who's now the head of cloud and Azure at Microsoft. And they pushed, let's try this. It's a little framework over here. If it succeeds, great. If it doesn't, no big deal. We haven't lost too much, but it was very successful. And you've seen it's grown and gone into other things. And now we've even got our whole Visual Studio Code editor, free, open source. And we see people at conferences that aren't Microsoft events and aren't talking about Microsoft technologies, with NASA engineers, and they're using Visual Studio Code to write code that'll be used on rockets. Oh, it's a thrill to see that.
Yeah, it's amazing and it's great. So thank you very much, Jeff Fritz, Senior Program Manager, Developer Group from Microsoft.
Yep.
Here of the Developer Week 2018.